Hi, Julie Usher. Welcome to Recipes for a Sweet Life. Today we'll be assembling this ornate 3D cookie bottle. It's supposed to be a perfume bottle. Why might we be making these? Just because I love to do things in 3D. People ask me a lot about design inspiration for my cookies and where it comes from. I tend to think out of the 2D plane, mostly because I'm so used to seeing cookies lying flat on the plate. I like to bring things up and into larger than life dimension. You might use these for a centerpiece, a fancy gift, what have you, or just for the fun and sheer surprise factor of it. I often just look around my environment to come up with cookie ideas. I was actually browsing in an antiques mall the other day and I saw this perfume bottle here and I thought, wow, I think I can cookie that because it's got some pretty standard shapes that I think would do well with cookie cutters and cake pans and other things that I typically shape cookies around. I'm also a big collector, so I drew the design inspiration a bit from this antique perfume bottle. I've got tons of these really ornate metal bottles and I thought I'd try to kind of simulate that. In another video, I'll be talking about the actual decorating of these pieces. This is largely an assembly video. Now that they're all decorated, I'm going to show you how to put it together. So let's get started with what you'll need. I'm going to put my glasses on. Again, I'd like to, they look fancy and complicated, but I tend to draw on pretty simple standard cutters. This is a 7 to 9 cookie piece project, depending on whether you use 2 of the pieces. You'll need 2 pieces for the base, and for that I use 2 standard plaque cutters, and the sources for my cutters will be found in the video description. So these 2 pieces are what they look like when they're iced, and they'll get stacked together to form the base of the perfume bottle. You'll also need a daisy shape. This is about 2 to 3 inches. This forms the lip, the upper edge of the bottle. 2 embossed pieces of any size. These are about 3 inches. I've got this one up here is about 4.5 inches. These are embossed using silicone molds, and I'm going to show you in a bit how to do that because it's a little bit out of the norm. And they'll go back to form the top of the stopper that gets attached to the lip. Optional pieces that you may or may not use are embossed roses, also formed the way the stopper pieces were for decorative embellishments. The daisies, by the way, for the topper base, they came from a standard Atico cutter set, so again, standard shapes. And then you'll need 2 decorated rounds. These are about 4 to 5 inches. That'll go back to form the base of the bottle, the body of the bottle rather, not the base. And they're all decorated. Let me show you again how I made some of the more novel pieces, namely the topper piece and the shape to make the body. As I said, the topper pieces are actually baked in a silicone mold. I have a whole nother video that talks about how to emboss cookie dough. You can either press the dough into it, the mold, and then release it, pop it out, and then trim it, and then bake it like so on the mat. That works. The disadvantage is it can spread a little bit more. So if you're only doing a few, sometimes it's advantageous to actually bake in the mold. That way the cookie dough can't spread. And you'll get a really crisp imprint like those that you saw on this cookie. This is about as sharp as it gets. Okay, and to do that, basically I take my dough. This is a gingerbread dough, and I'll have the recipe I'll have a link to the recipe in the video description. It's on my website. So what you would do, oops, just flouring that a little bit so my pin doesn't stick to it, is I just roll it as flat as I can into the mold. This is if I were baking in the mold, and then I trim off the edges. Roughly, it doesn't have to be exact at this point. Just want to make sure it's pressed very fully into the mold. It could even be flatter than that. And then you'd pop that in the oven, bake it. Then when it comes out, you would invert it the way you would if the dough were raw, and then trim the edges so that you get the nice, trim while warm, so you get the nice sort of ruffled edge to the mold. So you can do it either of 2 ways. In mold or out of the mold, you'll get a better, sort of more defined relief or texture if you bake in the mold. But again, you can really only do that if you have a few to do. Now the other novel shape was done by baking over a little 4 by 2 inch cake pan. I rolled out my gingerbread dough, I cut about a 5 to 6 inch round, and simply centered it on top of the cookie pan, then gently shaped it to conform. I haven't floured the pan, haven't done anything like that, just straight on the metal. Sometimes a few cracks form here and I'll just pat them closed. Then this goes on a cookie sheet in the oven, bakes the normal 10 minutes. I let it cool a couple of minutes, then simply pop it off the pan. It'll pop right off. And I have a whole nother video on how to contour dough like this and how to actually glaze it and ice it, as these cookies have been, and you should refer off to that. And as I also mentioned, we'll be talking in another video about how to decorate these pieces. I've relied heavily here on a lot of beadwork and applique techniques. I've got a lot of things stuck on these pieces. Make sure they're filed down nice and flat and fit well together back to back. I actually do that before I decorate, before all this stuff goes on. So you see they've got a nice, perfect fit. And that's because I filed them. And I use my microplaning tool to do that, which looks like this. Or a piece of sandpaper if you're not going to be eating these. The other thing I like to do is choose my front and the back. I tend to like this piece a little better because it's a little shinier. So I'm going to be using this as my back side. You want to work on bubble wrap once you've decorated the cookie so you don't mess up any of the decorations. And I've also got it supported on a piece of cardboard so that I can easily move it out of the way while it dries, because it's going to need to dry about a half an hour, an hour before I can lift it up and mount it. The other thing I've done, I don't know if you can see, but I've marked what I think is the top, because there's a definite orientation to these, and I want the various designs on the edges to all line up. So I've marked the top on each with a bit of edible marker, and I'm going to try to line that up. You'll see I've got it marked on the inside of this one too. Now, to glue together, this is nothing more than a gluing technique where I use my thick royal icing glue, and you'll see all my consistency adjustments in the link in the video description. I'm going to use a little extra both at the top and the bottom to make sure it really comes in contact, because I don't have the ability, like in some of my box projects, to come back on the inside and reinforce with more glue, because once this is glued, it is shut, and it is shut for good. The other thing I want to do is make sure everything's in alignment, and actually I'm going to rotate the box a little bit so I have more continuous patterns of the beads lining up and the brown pieces lining up. So my marking was a little bit off, I think. And then just make sure it's nicely lined up side by side. Now the other thing I'm going to do at this point is knock off any excess glue. I'm just going to make sure it's flush at the bottom, because the key thing, this is kind of like my sandwiching technique. It's going to be easier to mount in 3D if the bottom pieces are nice and lined up and flush at the bottom. Seems to be the case. The other thing I'm going to do at this point is come in and take out any extra glue that might be peeking out with my trussing needle. And I'm going to come back, there is a seam there, and I'm going to come back and kind of disguise that once it's a little bit more dry with some dot work. It looks pretty good. So we're going to set that aside, and while that's drying, I'm going to work a bit on the handle to get the handle and the topper to get that ready to go. Let's start with those embossed pieces. I talked a little bit about how to shape those before. What I want to do first is actually gild them. I think that accentuates some of the detail on top, and I'm working with a little bit of luster dust here on this little plastic lid that I use as my palette. You only need a very little bit of this. And I extend it with a little bit of extract, clear extract, just so I don't impart any color to it. Generally a 1-to-1 ratio of dust to powder creates a pretty thick paint. And I like to use my sponge brush for this. That way I'm just going to be gilding the top, you know, getting the relief. I'm not going to be getting down into the cracks. Whereas if you use a regular brush, sometimes you can paint into the deep areas, and I don't want to do that. I just want to highlight the top. Okay, those look pretty good. And that just needs a little bit of drying time. The alcohol will dry very, very quickly, so you can work with these almost immediately. Now, as with the body pieces that I put together, I'm going to work on bubble wrap, just so I don't mess up the surface too much. And what I'd like to do, so that there's more security, especially with this big, long 4-inch handle, is run a flat, this is a coffee stirrer, wooden coffee stirrer, up through the middle, just to give it more stability. I don't need a big long end because this has to fit through a very shallow stopper, that daisy cookie. So I'm going to cut it a little bit before I start, and I may have to cut it even more in the final assembly. And then I'm going to glue these pieces back to back, again with that same thick glue, icing glue, and I've basically chosen a color that matches Comes pretty close to the gingerbread, so if any squeezes out, we're less likely to see it. You don't necessarily need to use that stick in the middle because it does create a gap that's hard to close, but it does add a little more security. The other alternative is you can carve out a little bit of the cookie on the inside to create a channel for that stir so they're more likely to sit back to back flush. The next step is actually putting it into the topper piece. And that's the daisy that I've already decorated, and I've got a little bit of dot work on it and some applique work that was done with royal icing transfers. Normally I'd let this wait about a half an hour until it was completely dry before I'd mount it in the topper piece. But I'm going to go ahead and move forward with that. And as you can see, I don't want to see that extra craft stick, so I am going to cut this. This part's much easier to do when the cookies are dry. A little more glue in the center and just pop that on in and get it oriented in such a way that it's standing straight. Some of these dots I've got on the side are kind of interfering with the straightness of it. I want to look at it from both sides. I think that's pretty good. Now, and then I'd let that sit that to the side and let that dry for at least a half an hour and an hour. If I need to prop it, I can put a dragée container or something next to it to keep it standing up right. But I want to let it dry until the glue is completely set, and then we'll come back and put some embellishments down at the bottom to hide that little opening. So I am back. This topper that I just did, it still needs a little bit of gluing time. It's a little wobbly here. So I'm going to just set that aside and let it dry and work with one that's actually been drying a lot longer. I put this one together yesterday, and as you can see, the top's pretty darn secure. One thing I do want to do is add a few little embellishments at the base, and oftentimes you'll need to do this to conceal, less so on this one, but to conceal where the embossed piece hits the other piece. So I am going to stick here, in this case I'm going to stick, these are little white royal icing transfers that I made several days ago, and if I have too much glue showing, as I do here, I'll take a little bit off with my trussing needle. Royal icing transfers are things that you pipe onto acetate or parchment, let them dry, and then pop them off. And the advantage of doing that is you can control the exact shape of them a lot more easily than you can sometimes piping directly onto a cookie. So in this case, where I really wanted to control the shapes of these dots and rounds, I'm finding it handy to have done this before. And I want to do this on both sides of the topper. I think that just kind of finishes it off nicely. I'll do it on the back side as well. Again, I'm just sticking them down with a little bit of royal icing glue. And using my trussing needle to get them exactly where I want them. This is basically the process whereby I laid a lot of the beadwork onto the body of the perfume bottle. Okay, so that's the back side. That's the front side, just finished it off a little bit. You know, alternatively, you could put a pretty little rose. I could have put something like that there too, but I think that's a little bit much for this bottle because it doesn't have any embossed pieces other than the handle on it. Okay, the other thing to note on the topper pieces, and this I would do before putting the leaves on top, is I've carved out a little bit of the cookie at the bottom with a paring knife, and that's to allow it to sit really nice and flat and flush against the top of the bottle. And we'll test that again before I put it on the bottle, make sure I've carved out enough. I might have to carve out a little bit more. Okay, I'm back. I've elevated this. I like to be at eye level when I'm working on decorating on the sides of something tall. I'm not even eye level enough. I could be a lot higher. All I'm going to do right now is try to conceal this seam. I'm going to do that with a few dots. And I've got icing now of beadwork consistency. Again, the consistency adjustments, there will be a link to those in the video description. You could do a star border or anything else here, but I'm doing these dots because I want them to lie pretty flat and not interfere with putting the bottle together especially at the bottom. I started at the bottom, by the way, so I'm going to leave a little bit of gap here, just because that will make it easier. The less that's on the bottom, the more flat this is going to sit on the base. Okay, dry for half an hour, and then we'll mount it all together. Okay, it's been about a half an hour. The beads are dried on the body of my perfume bottle, so I'm going to mount it. There are different ways you can do this, but for a piece this big, I like to mount on styrofoam and use lollipop sticks as supports that I'll place in and around the body to keep it from moving. If it's lists at all, I can also use dragée containers to support it if I need that extra support. Now, bringing my body over. As I noted before, I marked my bottom. I'm just going to not generously, as little glue as possible because I don't want it to be seen. Stick it on the bottom and then mount it as close to center as possible, both looking at it this way and also side to side. I need to get over here and see if it's nice side by side. And as you can see, it's a little bit unsteady right now, so I'm going to use these dowel rods on either side to locate it. I knocked a bead off on the back when I picked it up, so I'll repair that also. But I'm basically sticking these dowels as close as I can to the center as possible. I think in this case I'm also going to move in these dragée containers to support from the front and the back. And then we will let it dry for at least an hour before I can put the topper on top, because we want the base to be completely secure. I'm going to stick one more in the back, one more dowel in the back. Okay, so I've got my 4 dowel rods in. I actually did need these dragée containers as additional support in both the front and the back, but I think it's pretty well aligned, and we're going to let it dry for about an hour or more until I can safely pull these out, or until it safely stands on its own. I'll probably leave these dowels in as I put the topper on top. Okay, it's been about an hour, and before I move anything, I'm just testing, and it seems pretty secure. So there it is mounted. And the last step is actually gluing the topper piece on top. And while I'm doing that, just to be on the safe side, I am gonna leave this front prop on here. If you need to knock off any of the beads, if they're interfering up at the top, you can do that too. But it's nice to do that with this fully supported. So just a little bit of glue. And again, I've carved it out, which is why it's sitting kind of nicely that way. And I just want to make sure this is centered both side to side and also front to back. That looks pretty good. That should be able to dry on its own, and in about an hour you can take all the pieces out and just slide this onto a display plate. So that's how you go about constructing a 3D perfume bottle. They can be as ornate or as simple as you'd like. And in another video, I'll show you about all the applique work, both the royalizing transfers and the embossed fondant pieces that form the center of the perfume bottle. Till then, live sweetly.